In the first scene, on Sol 18, Mission Day, the Ares 3 crew is busy with their task on the landing site. Mark Watney, being the resident botanist, collects a few samples on the site for chemoanalysis, while the rest go around with their respective tasks. Mark chit-chats over the radio with Martinez, the one in charge of their flight, who's fiddling with the MAV, with others listening in and commenting on Mark's small talk. Back at the HAB, Johansson, in charge of the crew control center, and Beck, the team doctor, are also busy with work. Johansson suggests to the captain to cut Mark's reception off the radio since he was talking nonstop. Of course, the commander gives the order, and he's cut shut. Almost immediately, there's an emergency mission update, and Johansson informs the crew about a storm approaching them. The captain asks to know how bad the storm was, and Johansson informs her that it would be destructive to the MAV. As everyone returns to the HAB to see what was going on, they noticed that the storm had escalated, and they needed to take quick action. Vogel, the team physicist, and Mark suggest waiting till the storm calms. However, Commander Lewis gives orders to abort the mission when the storm proved to be damaging their MAV. Martinez leaves to ready the ship for its launch before the MAV tips off due to the strong wind. They all put on their EVA suit and head out with Mark behind them, closing the HAB. As the crew struggle through the storm to get to the MAV, their satellite communication dish gets blown off. Those ahead are able to avert it from hitting them. However, Mark gets hit by it and is blown away by the storm. Everyone's in shock, and their efforts to hear from Mark are futile since they lost signals from him. The commander orders the teammates to return to the ship while she searches for Mark, hoping to get a signal from his suit. Martinez informs her that the MAV was tipping off and wouldn't hold any longer in the wind. However, she tells him to launch without her when it does. Beck breaks a harsh reality to her that Mark was eliminated since he wouldn't survive such a storm. Commander Lewis, however, returns to the ship since there was no sign of Mark. She gives Martinez orders to launch before their MAV tips off, shooting out of Mars without Mark. Meanwhile, back on Earth, NASA breaks the news to the public about aborting the Ares 3 mission to Mars, when the NASA satellites detected a storm approaching their mission site. He commends Commander Lewis's quick action on evacuating all team members to the ship, Hermes, before any further damage was done to the MAV. Following that, he breaks the sad news of Mark Watney's demise to the press, reporters causing a ruckus for further questions. Now back on Mars, surprisingly, Watney had survived the hit, and he gasps for air upon regaining consciousness with a critical oxygen level. He manages to pull himself out of the heap of sand, panting in pain as he tries to pull out a thin metal that punctured his EVA suit deep into his stomach. He then returns to the HAB to tend to his wound. He endures the pain through the process as he quickly pulls out the rod from his stomach. He cuts off his suit from his body and carefully takes out the remnant of the rod from his stomach, after which he stitches it. He not only grunts in pain from his injury, but is frustrated as he's been left stranded on a strange planet. Later on, Mark logs into the HAB journal and enters the log for Sol 19, a recording that he's alive. He explains that his blood and the antenna that pierced him had created a bridge on his suit which kept him alive. He records that he didn't die on Sol 18, knowing it would come as a surprise, or rather a shock to his crew, NASA, and the world at large. He has no way of communicating with NASA or his crew, and sadly, it'll take 4 years for another manned mission to reach him. He's stuck in a HAB that is designed to last for only 31 days. He explains that if he miraculously doesn't die of thirst or lack oxygen, he'd eventually run out of food supplies. Mark sits, waiting and thinking of ways to survive, and also signal to Earth. However, nothing seems to come to mind. It must have been impossible to stomach the fact that he was stranded on a planet where no one, except him. He goes about arranging stuff around the HAB, after which he takes a rest. He promises to stay alive, to himself. On Sol 21, Mark grunts in pain as he wakes up from sleep. He walks towards a table and places his hand on them, thinking of what to do next. He opens up a few cupboards and takes out food supplies. He begins to ration them while eating, after which he uses the bathroom, on vac, flushing his feces. An idea settles in as he hears the machine freeze dry and seal his waste. He immediately goes back to the kitchen to take out the whole potatoes they'd saved for Thanksgiving. He exclaims in excitement as he goes to enter the log for Sol 21. He records that he's rationed the food supplies to last him for 400 sols. He comes up with an idea to grow the whole potatoes to last him 3 years, and that, too, on a planet where nothing grows. Later on, he takes out a few sealed feces from the organic waste storage to use as compost for his plant. He moves the solar plates from their original position, making it face the sun directly. He dusts it off, allowing it to trap enough energy from the sun. He stacks some soil samples they'd brought from Earth into a cart, recording every bit of his action. Afterward, he treats his, still, bleeding injury. On Sol 24, Mark takes some sealed feces from the organic waste and stores it in a container. He sets up 2 enclosed tents attached to the mission rover using some tarpaulin. He packs Martian soil outside the hab, pouring it onto the floor of the tent. He takes a break afterward, drinking a grain juice after doing a task that was worth many hands. On Sol 31, he makes lines across the already spread Martian soil in the tent as ridges. He cuts open the sealed feces, and he also adds some earth soil, after which he mixes it with some liquid, covering his nose from the stench. He slices the whole potatoes into halves, and shortly afterward, he takes the compost alongside the potatoes and buries it. He uses the grain juice as water after covering it up. On Sol 36, Mark entertains himself with Commander Lewis's 80s music collection. He ponders on how to get enough water to farm the large square meter he'd created, with each cubic needing 40 liters of water to farm. Luckily, he's knowledgeable about the recipe being that he only needs to get oxygen to burn with hydrogen to produce water. Mark fills a cylinder with enough hydrogen from the MAV. He also uses a radium catalyst to help separate the oxygen from the carbon dioxide in the MAV fuel plant. He narrates the whole process and also how dangerous his plans would prove to be while entering the log for that soul. He carves out some wood for Martinez's crucifix to help make fire. He goes to bed with the crucifix, hoping and counting on it to work out. The next soul, he uses the wood chips to make fire. As soon as it catches fire, he places it on the valve connected to the hydrogen cylinder. He rejoices when he begins to see a few drops of water. However, he blows himself in the tent up when the lingering oxygen bursts into flames. Sol 37 log entry. He sits in front of the cam with an injured face and his ear still ringing from the explosion. He'd not accounted for the excess oxygen the radium valve would be separating from the carbon dioxide he'd been exhaling, thereby causing an explosion, since excess oxygen combined with hydrogen was highly inflammable. Later on, he puts on his EVA helmet with a radioactive suit as he marches toward the water plant. He repeats the previous steps he'd taken while setting up the water plant. However, it doesn't blow off this time. Mark wipes his hands on the water produced on the walls of the tent as the water spreads over the soil. He checks in on everything regularly, and he also adjusts the solar panels outside the HAP. He makes some repairs to his EVA helmet, and on Sol 54, he notices a little sprout of the plant inside the tent when he passes by with his plate of food. He then goes over to say hello to the little plant. Back on Earth, Teddy Sanders, the director of NASA, gives a speech at Mark's memorial service. In Johnson Space Center at Houston, NASA's director of Mars mission, Mr. Vincent Kapoor, meets with Teddy Sanders after Mark's memorial service to discuss another mission. He asks Teddy to authorize his satellite time. Since 5 Ares missions had been fully funded, they could get Congress to authorize a 6th. He explains that they utilize loads of supplies the Ares 3 mission had left behind to fund the Ares 6 mission. Teddy immediately disagrees with him, telling him that he wasn't the only one in need of satellite time. Teddy explains that since they were a public body, he wouldn't want to show pictures of Watney's body everywhere. Launching another mission immediately after the loss of an astronaut would be unpleasant to the public. Vincent then tells him that Mark's body wouldn't decompose, but Teddy explains that the meteorologists expect his body to be covered up by sand within a year. Vincent then proposes to him that they could express their sympathy to the Watney's family by bringing Mark's body back to Earth on the Ares 6 mission. He explains that they would put it to be a part of the mission's purpose, and they would get more support from Congress. However, waiting a year wouldn't benefit them. Meanwhile, at the Mission Control Center, Mindy Park receives a satellite report around 1:30 a.m. Upon accessing it, she's surprised and a bit confused as she notices a change at the Ares 3 landing site. She compares the landing site satellite time picture of Sol 18 and 54 a couple of times, after which she immediately puts a call through to the security, requesting an emergency contact fervency report. Vincent and Teddy, alongside Annie, arrive to confirm Mindy's report. Vincent is convinced that Mark is alive. He zooms in to show them the clean panels alongside the rover that had been moved, since Commander Lewis had plugged it to charge on Sol 17. However, Teddy argues that the wind might have cleaned the solar panels, and Annie suggests they call Commander Lewis on Capcom to confirm the position of the rover. However, Teddy immediately cuts in, telling her that if there's a possibility that Watney's alive, informing the Ares 3 crew would be a bad idea. He explains that the Ares 3 crew had 10 more months to return to Earth, and they needed to be focused. Side space travel was dangerous. He tells her that news would distract them, and Vincent concurs with Teddy, since informing the crew would make them devastated for leaving Mark behind. Annie is even more disturbed at what they would say to the public than telling the crew about Mark. She worries over what the public would throw at them for leaving Mark behind. Legally, they are to release the satellite pictures within 24 hours, so Teddy tells them to give a statement alongside the pictures, to the press. According to Teddy's calculations, Mark would probably be put to eternal rest from starving before they can help him. Vincent begins to worry over what Mark must be going through. Almost immediately, the scene switches to Mark dancing out of the shower to one of Commander Lewis's 1980s songs. Director Teddy Sanders addresses the press regarding the satellite pictures, proving that Watney was alive. His news causes a stir, as expected, with loads of questions rolling in from the press. Now back on Mars, while entering the Sol 70 log, Watney tells us that he has to begin thinking long-term. The next Ares mission to arrive will be Ares 4, and its landing site would be 100 kilometers away from him. He begins to map out the landing site. Before the Ares 4 arrives in 4 years, he needs to be at the site. He stacks some batteries at the back of the rover, after which he explains that the rover he'd use to travel around Mars can only handle 35 kilometers at the maximum before its battery dies, in which he'll need to recharge at the hab afterward. He goes ahead to talk about his second problem. The journey will take him 50 days, and he'll have to live in a rover with life support like that of a small van. His only option is to do some science to work it out, after which he maps out a spot on his map. The next scene shows him in a rover on Sol 74, riding away from the hab. He almost dozes off while driving, but he immediately snaps out of it. Later, into a freezing night, Mark explains that he had successfully doubled his battery life. However, he can't use the heater to warm himself up, since it would mean that his battery life wouldn't last. Unfortunately, if he doesn't use the heater, he could freeze to eternal rest, so he calls off the journey to find a solution for a heater. The next Sol, Mark solves his heating problem by digging up a radioisotope thermoelectric generator to attach it to the rover. Although using the RTG proves to be dangerous to humans, he only has to be careful so he doesn't break it. He pulls out the buried RTG and attaches it to the rover. He wraps it up with foil, after which he returns to his seat to continue his journey. Log entry by astronaut Watney on Sol 76. Mark rejoices over his success in finding a solution to his heating problem. He plays the only disco song he'd found in Commander Lewis's file, dancing while enjoying his ride. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Watney's every movement has been monitored by NASA. During a press meeting about the new satellite pictures, one of the reporters asks Vincent about Mark's destination. He explains to them that Mark was taking the rover out for longer trips since he was preparing for a long journey. Another question comes in as to why Mark would leave a safe region for somewhere dangerous. Vincent then explains that they suspect he wants to go to the landing site of Ares 4 to try to make contact with the rover. However, if they could communicate with him, they'd ask him to stay put since they were working on ways to bring him home alive. Upon hearing him, Annie gives him a quick stare, after which they exit the meeting immediately. Meanwhile, Teddy, alongside others, in a conference room, watches Vincent's speech to the press on TV. Vincent and Annie head to the conference room after the meeting. Upon reaching the conference room, she asks him not to mention bringing Mark home alive during a speech anymore. She explains that saying such would only make people worry that Mark might be eliminated on Mars. Teddy Sanders immediately cuts in as they enter, telling Vincent not to mention bringing Mark home alive anymore. Vincent tells him that he was just trying to be positive. Teddy goes through a few reports, and he's shocked to see that Mark had traveled 76 kilometers despite the maximum battery life of their rover. He then asks Mindy about it, and she explains to him that Mark drives for 2 hours and then does a short EVA. She assumes he might have used the time to change batteries. Teddy then asks if he'd changed his oxygenator or done any other thing during the EVA break. Mindy then goes further to explain that every 41 hours, there's a 17 minutes gap due to the way the orbit works, and it was possible they'd missed something. Teddy then gives her full authority over the satellite trajectory orbital adjustments. He asks her to reduce the gap to 4 minutes so that they can capture everything without missing any detail. Binsey returns to her seat after receiving he was done with her. Teddy goes ahead to talk about Mark's movement to the Ares 4 site. He knows that Mark is smart enough to know that going to the site is his only chance. He then asks Bruce Ng, the director of her production laboratories, over a video call about the earliest it would take for pre-supplies to reach the Ares 4 site, assuming Mark reaches the site. Bruce then tells him that with the position of the Earth and Mars, it would take a total of 9 months, with 6 months for building it. Teddy immediately cuts into his explanation, telling him to make it ready in 3 months. The JPL crew exclaimed since it was impossible to prepare such supplies within 3 months. Teddy then threatens him with making a report on the JPL's building capabilities, and by his calculations, the overtime dedicated to the work would be a nightmare. Bruce doesn't have to do the math to know how draining the overtime would be. Teddy tells him that he'd fund him the money, so they should get to work. Just then, Mitch Henderson, the Hermes director of flight, brings up the issue of informing the crew about Mark. Vincent tells him that they'd already discussed it. However, Mitch is bent on telling the crew since he decides on what's best for them. He feels that the crew deserves to know about Mark. Teddy then tells him that they can only inform them once there's a plan to rescue Mark. Since Bruce has 3 months to come up with the pre-supply, they'd tell them only after 3 months, with Bruce saying they'd do their best at JPL. Upon hearing him, Teddy cuts him and saying, Mark dies if he doesn't. Back on Mars, Mark cultivates his potatoes after 48 sols, and they grew even better than he'd expected. He carefully uproots them, after which he keeps the plant to further use it. Log entry 79, he's now become the first one to grow healthy potatoes on the Martian soil. However, his achievements wouldn't matter if he doesn't figure out a way to communicate with NASA. He zooms in on a map when was looking at it, and then he picks on a spot saying he knows what to do. He rides on the rover to the same spot on the map. Meanwhile, Mindy informs Vincent about Mark's movement, and he's confused about where he was headed since he hadn't taken the course for over 13 days. He was also not headed to the Ares 4 and wasn't taking a straight route, so it gets Vincent wondering. Mindy suggests he might be trying to avoid some obstacles on his way. However, Vincent tells her that there was nothing out there except them, pausing without completing his statement. Mindy asks to complete his statement, but he immediately requests for a map. He rushes into one of their workspaces, taking down a Mars map from a wall, with one of the workers questioning. He apologizes and borrows a marker and ruler from one of them. He traces the HAB and Mark's current location to a possible destination. Vincent immediately catches on to where Mark was headed, and Mindy's mouth falls open in shock. Vincent leaves to get on an airplane. Meanwhile, on Mars, Mark arrives at his destination, and almost immediately, the scene switches back to Vincent arriving at the JPL in California. Bruce and G welcomes Vincent, and they head to his workspace. While Bruce introduces Vincent to his workers, Mark stumbles upon something on the Mars, and he begins to pull out something from the sand, leading him to another device buried in the sand. Meanwhile, Vincent asks to see the replica of what Mark was digging up. He finally uncovers a device he and Vincent call the Pathfinder. Mark opens it up and attaches it to his rover. On Sol 109, Mark boards it at the HAB. He sets it up after taking some cables and battery from the HAB, and the crew on Earth set up theirs as well, waiting for the signal. After waiting a while, the test line finally turns on, and immediately the JPL acquire a signal to their own test line, with Vincent rejoicing. They initiate the camera on the test line, and at the same time, the camera on Mark's side is also initiated. After waiting a while, Mark rushes into the HAB. He takes out 3 small whiteboards, asking if they could read him. Immediately, the JPL receives his picture, and Vincent immediately asks the guy in charge to point the camera at yes. Before he does so, he implies that the communication method wasn't exactly a good one, since they could only answer Mark's questions without being able to convey their own messages to him. Of course, they know that well, but Vincent just asks him to point the camera, since they could handle the rest later. The guy points to the camera, letting Mark know they could read him. Mark immediately jumps for joy as he receives the message. Mark figures he could use the camera as it is to get more technical conversations. He goes through his colleague's stuff and takes out Johansson's laptop. He sends a chart with alphanumeric units from the laptop to his. He then goes ahead and makes a large circumference around the camera, after he marks around the circumference with a foot long each. He then places some whiteboards with numbers on it, with each representing an alphabet. The JPL catch on to what he was getting at, and they immediately set up the same thing at their workspace. After a while, they're able to send a message to Mark, using the pointer on the camera to relay their message. Immediately after Mark receives it, he returns to the HAB and translates the message according to the charts. The JPL asks Mark how he's alive, and he responds, with his answer on a whiteboard for them to capture it through the camera. Not quite long, the JPL receives his response, and Bruce wakes up dozing Vincent to see Mark's reply. The conversations between Mark and NASA progress. The experts in NASA instruct him on how to hack the rover operating system into allowing the Pathfinder to communicate with it. He follows the instructions, and NASA is able to link the rover to the Pathfinder to allow a broadcast without having to use pictures. In NASA's control room, everyone gathers around watching the message broadcast as Vincent, at JPL, communicates with Mark. He sends a heartwarming message to Mark, letting him know they've been watching him from Sol 54 and are rooting for him. He informs him that they'd be sending some pre-supplies for him to survive before the Ares 4 arrive. With everyone emotional, watching the messages, Mark's is no less emotional and glad to hear from them. Mark replies to them, saying he's really looking forward to not being put to eternal rest, as usual. He gets everyone laughing. Well, the mood switches to an uncomfortable one when Mark asks what the crew had said when they knew he was alive. Bruce asks his workers to give him and Vincent a little space. Bruce then asks Vincent if it was right to tell him the truth, and Vincent nods, typing his reply. He informs Mark that they hadn't told the crew just yet since they needed to focus on their mission. Upon receiving it, Mark freaks out, sending his replies with the F word. He gets everyone laughing, and Vincent makes him know that his messages were broadcasted live and worldwide, so that he could be cautious of his contact. Upon receiving the message, Mark is surprised, however, his humor doesn't cease. He gets everyone chuckling yet again at his message, except Teddy Sanders, and Vincent tries comprehending what he'd sent. The next scene shows Teddy Sanders receiving a call as he walks into the office where Mitch and Annie were waiting. After he drops the call, he informs them that he was on a call with the President of the United States, trying to explain Mark's last message. Mitch then tells the director that it was time to tell the crew the truth, since they couldn't keep them in the dark anymore. He explains that whatever Mark had said was right, and the crew needed to know the truth to be at ease. Teddy then asks him if he was only bringing it up since Vincent was away. However, Mitch tells him that he doesn't have to wait for Vincent to decide what the crew really needs. The next scene shows the Hermes in space, and it's been 4 months since their departure from Mars. Commander Lewis stands at a window in the ship, staring into space. Not quite long, Johansson calls for her, and she goes down to the control room. She meets Martinez, who's in a hurry to check out something, and when Commander Lewis asks him, he tells her that his son had turned 3, and his wife had sent some birthday pictures for him to see. The duo goes down to the control room to meet with the others. While Johansson goes through some messages, a new video immediately comes in, meant for the whole crew. She informs them, and they gather around to watch it. In the video, Mitch reveals the truth about Mark to the crew. He gives them reasons why they hadn't informed them earlier. The message comes as a shocker to them, and Commander Lewis begins to blame herself for leaving Mark behind. When they try comforting her, she tells them that they were just following her orders, implying that she was responsible for leaving Mark behind. On Sol 128, Mark sets up a camera on his potato farm, recording everything he does. He explains that since there was no communication with NASA, everyone was now interested in his activities. He talks about he's been receiving lots of emails and how his alma mater had sent him some tips for his farm. They'd also told him that he'd colonized Mars since he was the first to plant on the Martian. He calls himself the best botanist, and he also talks about the message he'd received from NASA, asking him for a photograph on his next transmission. Afterward, he begins practicing how he'd pose for the picture, although not sure of the right pose. The next scene shows him uncovering the Pathfinder and standing for a picture in front of its camera. At NASA, Annie is a bit annoyed to see Mark in a spacesuit in the picture, since she needed the world to see his face. Vincent explains to her, over a video call, that taking his spacesuit would mean that he'd be put to eternal rest. Vincent's reply to Annie gets everyone chuckling. Shortly afterward, Teddy announces that they'd be sending the pre-supplies to Mark in a year, with the traveling time being within 9 months. They discuss how much Mark has to survive before the arrival of the pre-supply. Vincent informs him that the botanist reports that Mark has been doing a good job so far, and his food would last him till Sol 912. Teddy urges Bruce to make everything ready for the pre-supply. As he walks away, he mutters that everything would be all right if only nothing happens. Almost immediately, the scene switches to where Mark accidentally blows off the HAB, with the explosion flinging him and the HAB away. His oxygen level gets critical, and he manages to use tape to seal the cracks on his helmet before he suffocates. He walks towards the plant tent, only to find all his plants burned to ashes. He returns to the rover and freaks out in annoyance since all his efforts had been burned down. Everyone receives sad news about the crops. Vincent explains that the crops had died since they were exposed to Mars' atmosphere. According to their calculations, Mark won't survive Sol 600, since all his food would only last him to Sol 458. He also can't plant anymore since the potatoes he had couldn't be cultivated. NASA now has a change of plan, and they need to send supplies to Mark before their actual time. Instead of the time they'd agreed to launch the pre-supplies to Mars, Teddy gives the team 47 days to get everything ready. He instructs Mark to inform Bruce of the change of plans. Upon receiving the message, Bruce walks away to get changed, knowing it wouldn't be an easy task. Meanwhile, the crew is able to communicate with Mark, and Martinez sends messages to him, with the crew laughing at the conversation. He then tells Martinez that he'd accidentally blown up the HAB. However, Commander Lewis's music survived. He tells Martinez to say hello to the crew, smiling from the heartwarming conversation with Martinez. The next Sol, he returns to the site and clears out the dead plants from the HAB. He uses the tarpaulin to cover up the entrance of the HAB, after which he stabilizes the pressure in the HAB and seals off some air holes. Later on, he draws out his potatoes and begins to count them. Now back at the JPL, a guy walks to an office where he wakes a sleeping Rich Purnell, an astrodynamics, up from sleep. Rich behaves in a rather confused manner, spewing the coffee he sipped into a basket. His boss asks about how quickly a jet could be launched to Mars from Earth. Rich begins to explain to him, however, he pauses when an idea settles into his head. He keeps his boss in suspense as he walks clumsily towards the kitchen to get another coffee. He returns to his seat to return to work, without letting it out, with his boss still waiting for him to complete his sentences. His boss walks away, gently asking him if he realizes that he's his boss, and Rich acts no different, nodding his reply to the questions as though it meant nothing. Meanwhile, the JPL sends in the bill for making the probe to Teddy. Teddy is a bit shocked by the bill, and he asks Bruce, over a video call, about it to confirm the amount. Teddy then asks Bruce about how long it would take for the probe to be ready, and Bruce tells him it would take 15 days for it to be ready. After a few suggestions and arguments, Teddy manages to agree on a lesser time with Bruce. He rules out the inspection of the probe to accelerate the launch time. He asks them to inform Mark to stretch his ration to 4 more days before the probe arrives. As instructed, Mark rations his food for 4 more days, although the decision was draining. Meanwhile, on Earth, everyone's busy with the pre-supply setup for Mark. In a workspace, Rich's boss talks about how they'd adjust some satellite movement since they'd been able to push the launch of the probe earlier than it should be. After some of them ask what Rich has been doing about the situation, he dashes off to look for him. Upon seeing him, he asks how far he'd gone with his calculations, and Rich asks him for more time. The next scene shows everyone in NASA watching the launch of the probe and their respective teams. Those at JPL, all tensed, watch the launching of the probe. With NASA preparing to launch it at their control center, however, they rejoice when the probe seems to have been successfully launched. Unfortunately, it faces a little malfunction and the launching fails. Everyone is heartbroken from what happened. Vincent receives a message from Mark asking how the launch went. He relays the sad news to him. Mark sits watching the vast horizons as the scene switches to where he'd sent a message to the crew, asking them to relay a message to his parents. He tells them to let his parents know that he liked his work, to make them feel strong. He sent those messages, probably thinking he'd starve to eternal rest. Now, at the China National Space Administration, Zhu Tao, Deputy Chief Scientist of CNSA, watches the news on NASA's failure to launch their probe. The Chief of Scientists, CNSA, Goodming, also watches alongside her. During the interview with Vincent and Teddy on TV, they learned that they'd skipped inspecting the probe so that they could accelerate the launch time. Goodming immediately switches the TV off, saying that the NASA astronaut on Mars would be put to eternal rest by the way things were going. Just then, Zhu Tao tells him that there was still another way for him to survive. She explains that their engineers had done the calculations and the Tianyangsheng booster had enough fuel to launch to Mars. Goodming then asks why NASA hadn't contacted them for help, now getting up from his seat, and Zhu explains to him that NASA is unaware. She explains that by helping them, the world would know of their contribution, and NASA would also help them in time of need. However, it had cost them to give up a booster and cancel the Tianyangsheng completely. He then tells her that the matter should be kept between the scientists. There's good news for everyone, with Teddy receiving a call from the CNSA. Also, at the Pleiades, NASA Advanced Supercomputer, Rich finally gets his calculations right. He takes a flight over to NASA, looking all shabby. Upon arriving, he heads straight to Vincent's office, asking Vincent to drop his call so he could talk. Vincent's even more confused as to who he was then having the audacity to tell him to hang up his call. However, Rich introduces himself and gets straight to business. Not long, Annie walks into an office where she meets Teddy, Mitch, Vincent, and of course, Rich. As Annie arrives for the meeting, she asks why the mission had a strange name on its invitation, and Teddy explains that it's a secret meeting only within themselves. After a little small talk, she asks about who Rich is, and Vincent introduces him to her. After the introduction, Vincent asks him to repeat everything he'd told him to everyone. He then uses Annie and Teddy for demonstration. According to him, he'd done the calculations, and his plans will be successful. He proposes that the Hermes change their course towards Mars, and the Taimsheng would provide them with enough supplies before they head towards Mars. Meanwhile, Mark would intercept himself from Mars using the MAV. The crew would rescue him, and everyone returns home. Bruce and Rich's boss seems to agree with him since it was the best idea so far. However, Teddy sends him out. Teddy then asks the members if Rich was right, and of course, he was. However, they'd be adding an extra 500 days to the crew's mission. They're caught between losing a whole crew or one astronaut. They're to either send the Tai Im-sheng to Mark or send it to the crew to last them the extra days while they rescue Mark. When Bruce asks how they'd make the decision, Vincent implies that Teddy would be the only one to decide. However, Mitch suggests they tell the crew about it since it was right for them to make the decision. Teddy cuts him in, telling him they'd go with their initial plan of sending the Tai Im-sheng to Mark until the Ares 4 mission is launched. Mitch walks away, irritated by their decision. Back on Hermes, Vogel goes to have a little talk with Johansson while she works out at the gym. He tells her that he'd received a message from his family, and she takes him to check it out on their system. Upon accessing it, she notices a message come in. Rich Pannell had sent the analysis of the rescue mission to the crew, notwithstanding NASA's disagreement. The crew sits to discuss the situation, with Commander Lewis telling them she would stick to the plan if it were to be up to her. However, NASA strongly disagrees with the plan, and each of them has to think about the consequences before anything else. Martinez doesn't even give her a chance to complete her statement when he votes to go ahead with the plan. Lewis asks him to calm down and think it through, explaining that they might not be sent to space for some time after embarking on the plan. However, Johansson does her calculations and tells the crew that the mission would be possible and she could do it. Martinez votes to go through with the rescue plan alongside everyone. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the NASA control room receives the message from Hermes. They inform them about Rich Pannell and that they'd be changing the course of their mission. It gets everyone wondering, and one of the workers asks to check if the cause of their change, of course, was due to a malfunction of the Hermes. The man is even more perplexed at who Rich Pannell is, so he asks Mindy about it. She tells him that she had no idea, since the meeting with Rich was only within the board of directors. He then yells, asking someone to find out about Rich Pannell. In a team meeting with Mitch, Teddy discusses the maneuver Rich had sent to Hermes with. He suspects Mitch had something to do with it, so he talks about how a single life wasn't more important than the purpose of their mission. Mitch cuts him in, telling him that no life was less important. However, Teddy tells him that he'd be expecting his resignation when the dust settles, telling him to bring their astronauts home. Saw a 219 log entry. Mark talks about how he'd be using the map that's already at the Ares 4 Schiaparelli crater to go into orbit. By doing so, the crew would catch him in space as the Hermes passes by the Mars orbit. However, to journey to the Schiaparelli crater on the Ares 4 landing site, he has to carry along everything that he'll need to survive with him. Unfortunately, the rover was too small to handle it, but the experts in NASA instructed him on what to do. In the next scene, he drills open the roof of his rover, as instructed. While doing so, the team members back on Earth do the same thing on a similar rover. NASA meets with the CNSA officially to commence with the Tiana. Meanwhile, Mark packs up, writing goodbye messages on some stuff in the HEB, and also rationing the food supplies he'll be needing. Also, in Back on Hermes, the crew has quality time catching up with their loved ones over video calls. The JPL, alongside Mark, on Mars, prepare their respective rovers. Mark attaches an air sac at the open roof of the rover, after which he inflates it. The JPL team also inflates the air balloon on their rover, but it blows off. However, Mark's own was perfect, since he'd used straps to hold it together down. The team members alongside the NASA team meet at the CNSA control room for the Toyangsheng launch. They all watch the Toyangsheng booster being launched to the Hermes. Mitch gives Teddy a quick look, while everyone else in the control room rejoices over the success of the probe launch. At the Hermes, the Taoyangsheng arrives with their supplies. Matt goes down to the Hermes exit to see where the probe will be attached, while Martinez handles the controls. Martinez directs the probe gently to the Hermes exit, and they successfully mount it to their ship. It's after 7 months, and on Sol 461, the scene shows Mark coming out of the shower, looking emaciated with a few scars on his body and with overgrown beards. He shuts down the NASA system in the HAB, after which he heads out of the HAB. He enters the rover and proceeds for a ride. Mark takes a little walk, after which he charges the solar panels and sleeps under the rover for a while. He talks about how strange it feels to be the first to do whatever, or reach anywhere around Mars. Back on Earth, in the NASA control room, Mindy tells Vincent that Mark had been keeping to schedules. They'd instructed him to drive for hours, take out the solar panels to recharge, take walks, and then sleep anywhere to while away time. On Sol 494, Mark drives along the vast horizons of the Martian, repeating every schedule as instructed. The next scene shows Vincent and Mitch on a video call with Bruce, discussing what the MAV Mark would be used to intercept into Mars orbit. Mitch explains to Vincent that for the MAV to be able to escape the gravity on the Mars orbit, they'd need to make the MAV lighter. Bruce then begins demonstrating with a MAV prototype. He takes out the seats, leaving only one, which Mark would be using, and some control panels. Vincent immediately cuts him in, asking if he'd be shooting Mark to space using remote controls. He then tells him to proceed with his demonstration, and Bruce then removes the nose of the MAV to attach a tarpaulin to it. Vincent's mouth falls open when Bruce begins to explain how using a tarpaulin would reduce the weight of the MAV to allow it to accelerate fast. Mark receives the message about how he'd be traveling in the MAV. His reply to the message gets Vincent, in the control room with Mindy, wondering how the expression on Mark's face was when he sent it. On Sol 538, Mark arrives at the Ares 4 landing site. After a little small talk, while entering the Sol 538 log, he drives towards the MAV. Mark climbs into the MAV, and he does everything as instructed by NASA, repeating the same process Bruce had demonstrated to Vincent. He then attaches the tarpaulin at the top of the MAV after detaching the nose from it. Meanwhile, in the Hermes, the crew prepares their ship for the big rescue. After a while, the crew discusses the plan over a meal. They come to an agreement on a foolproof plan with Commander Lewis, telling them that if they succeed, they'll bring Mark on board. However, if they fail, they'd have to go after him. On Sol 561, Mark has his meal, after which he writes a little message, saying the rover had saved his life, and he exits the rover. Meanwhile, on Earth, everyone gathers at New York Times Square, witnessing the Ares 3 live rescue mission. In the NASA control room, the team members are tense since the crew was about to kick off a risky plan. Meanwhile, Mark looks at himself in a mirror, almost in disbelief at how he looked, after which he shaves off his overgrown beards, puts on his spacesuit, and is ready for his launch. The crowd gathers around to witness the crew's rescue attempt for Mark. Mark launches into space, however. The tarpaulin on the MAV gets blown off, and it results in Mark passing out, while the MAV pulls backward. With the MAV and Mark floating in space, the crew tries to get him to respond. However, he doesn't, and it gets everyone worried. He finally wakes up, with everyone letting out a sigh of relief. However, the distance created due to the accident turns out to be farther than estimated. After some calculation, Commander Lewis suggests they set off an explosive to help increase the thrust of the Hermes. Mark, over the MAV, tells them that he could grab sharp objects to pierce his spacesuit so that he could speed towards them. However, Commander Lewis dismisses his idea, and she announces the new plan to NASA. Her plans stir quite an uncomfortable reaction, since it was risky to launch an explosive in space. Meanwhile, Vogel makes the explosives using a few of their supplies, while Johansson assists him. Johansson then goes over to Beck, handing him the explosive. She gives him a hug, kisses Eva's helmet, and asks him to be careful, although telling him not to tell anyone. The plan sets off, however. Commander Lewis decides to head out so she could grab Mark. As the explosive sets off, it pushes the Hermes a little further to Mark, and Commander Lewis moves further to Mark with the rope on her suit attached to the Hermes. However, Mark grabs a sharp object to pierce his spacesuit so he could speed toward her when she is unable to reach him. Unfortunately, she fails to grab him, leaving everyone in suspense as Mark begins to float away, however. He grabs the rope that was attached to the ship, and with that, Commander Lewis pulls him closer, and they successfully rescue him. The movie switches to emotion as everyone on Earth and the crew jubilates on the successful rescue attempt, with the crew hugging him. The next scene shows Mark sipping coffee, after which he touches a little sprout of plant, saying hello to it. It's Mark's first day on Earth after returning from the life-threatening mission. He addresses some students in a lecture room, while he uses his experience on Mars to point out some facts while teaching them. Meanwhile, the Ares 4 mission is set to be launched, and Martinez is one of the crew members. Each crew member of the Ares 3 mission watches, at their respective places, the launching of the Ares 4 mission. The movie concludes with everyone jubilating on the successful launch of the Ares 4 mission.
And that's a wrap for today's Rewind.
If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Cinewind, and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the worlds of movies, series, and anime. Got a film, show, or hidden gem you want us to cover next? Drop it in the comments below. We read them all. Until next time, keep watching, keep wondering, and let the stories live on. This is Cinewind, signing off.